Hello, everybody. So quite a few of you have joined us in the past. I'm Karin Hoskin, the Executive Director of Coho US, and Karen Gibnig is on as well, the Associate Director. And we're here with Ronnie Rosenbaum tonight to talk. What the heck are we talking about? What's the title of tonight's web chat?
Improving communication.
Aha, excellent. I figured it was some communications thing. So I'd like to introduce Ronnie. She's lived in co-housing in Golden, Colorado since 1997 and an intentional community for 5 years in the 70s. She's a professional mediator with many years of experience assisting communities, organizations, and families. She was trained in nonviolent communication by Marshall Rosenberg. She consults, facilitates, and provides workshops about a variety of topics, such as developing inclusive yet efficient processes, decision-making, managing conflict, and improving communication. So the most important skill that she'll bring in is helping people with the process of hearing and understanding one another so that then they can problem solve and agree on what will work for them given their unique composition, values, and needs. She was recently reviewed for an article about communicating and relating to neighbors in co-housing, appearing in the December 2018 issue of Real Simple, How to Love Thy Neighbor. And this was shared through the Coho US e-news, the Co-housing Now e-news. So through her professional and personal endeavors, she's able to actualize her commitment to being a peacemaker. Welcome, Ronnie.
Thank you, Karin. It's great to be here and to be able to sit in the comfort of my home and share with all of you. Thank you for participating, everyone. So I'm assuming most of us are living in co-housing or interested in living in co-housing. And what I've found both in my experience in living in a community for 22 years and just in work I've done in groups is that we have so many opportunities and challenges for communication. And I'm just doing okay, I got a message that said I'm muted.
Nope, you were briefly, but
okay, great. I just want to make sure that I'm not talking to myself, which I do sometimes. So what my intention is to do this evening is to talk about what we can do as individuals, regardless of where we live, what we can do to improve communication. And we're all communicating constantly with people we live with people we interact with, and in our co-housing communities. And then what can co-housing communities do to help with communication within our communities? So the first piece I'm going to talk about is how do we improve our general communication? And in my mind, the goal of communication is to establish connections. Now, there are times where we have very brief interactions with people, and still we want to connect with them. And then there are times, particularly in people we live with and in people that we spend more time with, that we want to strengthen relationships. And we focus on understanding and hearing people, not on persuading or convincing them. Those are two really different things. We want to try to change people's opinions versus when we really want to communicate deeply and understand others, hear others, and hopefully help them understand us. And a big part of that is that we take responsibility for our own feelings and needs and try to understand those feelings and needs of others so that they're heard, we're heard, even if there's not agreement. And I'm going to now jump to some brief communication tools. And this is the handout that Karin has, that Karin's going to share. And what I've put together is what I call 10 steps for conversations that lead to resolution. And these are applicable in so many interactions we have in our lives. The first thing is to set the stage and not just burst out with something that we have a concern about, but really make sure that it's a good time for the other person. The next thing is to figure out who needs to be involved with that conversation. Are the right people involved? And then we get into some more communication strategies that are helpful. So we start the conversation using iMessages, and we observe without evaluating. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about how do we do that? How do we talk so people can hear? And we listen to understand and identify needs, not to, as the next step says, we don't jump to making assumptions. So part of that is asking and finding out what's going on with the other person. We separate the problem from the person. And this is a strategy in mediation that's so important, is that we try to come together with the other person, the other people, and attack the problem. We don't want to attack the other person. We brainstorm options to how we can resolve the problem, and we do that with the other people who are involved. We choose a mutually agreeable solution, and we reiterate and confirm agreements and follow-up steps. And in finalizing that, we agree on a process to resolve differences in the future. Because even though we go through this, it's pretty much of a never-ending cycle. So that's sort of a quick and dirty 10 steps that help in having more positive conversations. And now I'm going to jump to nonviolent communication, non-adversarial communication. And this is a process developed by Marshall Rosenberg. And it really is focusing on being non-judgmental and developing compassionate, empathetic communication. And it's a pretty simplistic in just laying it out. And there's some great books Marshall Rosenberg has. And a big part of that is that we speak first with observing and not getting into a judgment. And they're factual observations. So somebody else who's in that situation could also make that observation. And I have some examples. I don't know if I really need to go into them, but I mean, an example is if it's 1 o'clock in the morning and there's loud music, instead of saying your music is obnoxious, is really saying it's 1 o'clock, the music is playing, I can hear it. And what feelings are being triggered by that observation? I'm tired, I'm feeling anxious if it's keeping me awake at 1 a.m. And my neighbor may not know about that. Then moving to the need, and we have universal needs as identified by Marshall Rosenberg and others who are leaders in the field. And a need that I would have if I'm up all night trying to go to sleep is I have to function well at work tomorrow, and I need sleep tonight. And then the last part of the process is making a concrete request for an action that will help meet that need. So an example with this may be, would you be willing to turn the sound down so it can't be heard outside of your house, outside of your bedroom? And then a follow-up request might be, would it be okay with setting a time tomorrow that we could talk about some options so that this isn't a problem in the future? And then that really circles back to the 10 steps. It's setting the stage. So it's not, everybody's tired. You don't want to jump into trying to figure out a solution, but you want to set the time. And then there's, and I'm not going to even go over this, but this will be, as Corinne said, this will be on the website. Karin, I apologize. This will be on the website, and there's some easy templates for how you can use this. And there's many other iMessages that people can give and different strategies that work, and it's just trying to figure out what people are comfortable with and not attacking the other person. So I'm going to now jump away from that, and that's just sort of the basic, how do we improve our communication in general? And now we're going to go to co-housing communities. And what can our co-housing community do to improve communication? How do we apply these tools to our communities and our communication within our communities? And the first piece that I wanted to talk about was just some more structural pieces and things that help in setting the groundwork in a co-housing community in the initial formation and on an ongoing basis as the community evolves. It's so important to have clear expectations about communication, and a big part of communication is how do you deal with conflict? And how we deal with conflict, how we establish norms in communication, change in our community, change when turnovers in the community. So an important piece of that is having an orientation for new members and have that as an ongoing basis so that everyone is on the same page. And reviewing that for longtime members, because we all forget. It's important to have clear communication agreements and guidelines. And what I've found in Harmony Village, where I live, and in working with other co-housing communities, is part of that's important is having direct communication. And that's with the person involved with an issue, not going to somebody else who becomes a go-between. And triangulation, which is using a third person to be the intermediary, tends to be pretty detrimental unless everybody agrees to that. The parties who are involved figure this third person's important. They want to use the third person potentially as a facilitator for conversation. That's one thing. It's different than if I have a problem or concern, I go to somebody else and I complain, and then there are rumors and somehow it makes it back to the person who I had the problem with or the concern about, and it's not resolved. It just exacerbates the situation. And it's also helpful to have someone in a community who is the designated person to facilitate difficult conversations. And it doesn't have to be a mediator. It just is somebody who has some skills and is comfortable and is willing to get involved. It's important not to speak critically about others behind their backs. And that is an important piece of a communication agreement. Nowadays, very different than when I started living in a co-housing community in 1997, is we all communicate electronically via email, etc. And it's important that emails are not used for communicating feelings, and they're not for decision making. They're really for information, and that people are aware that we don't forward personal emails without the permission of the sender. And that's an important piece to check out. So those are just some general communication guidelines that I think every community needs to shape their own and have them available and make sure everybody's aware of them. One of the things that has been helpful at Harmony Village, and I've suggested this for a few other communities, is that there be a vehicle for people to share questions and suggestions. And we have a suggestion box at Harmony Village. People can put concerns, comments, questions in them, and then we can look at those. And a lot of those we found out have happened because people have made assumptions and they haven't been checked out. And those questions, we have a coordinating council. Most communities have some sort of a governing group, steering committee, and the coordinating council looks at those questions and then tries to provide answers. And if there's no answer available and it's an issue, we try to figure out how we're going to deal with that. But it's just so easy to jump to conclusions, and a lot of times those conclusions trigger us and we make up these stories about what's going on. two other pieces that are important structurally that are not directly what I would consider communication parts, but impact communication. One is that we have a way as a community of holding on to our institutional memories, that we have records of decisions that have been made, and that we have some way of tracking issues that need follow-up, and that those don't get lost. And people can return to that when needed and have a way to track down prior decisions made, because it's so easy to go off and spend a lot of time spinning our wheels when this has already been discussed 10 years ago, decided, and this is having those decision logs or other ways of having institutional memory will really help us. And then the other piece that's important for communities is that there's transparency between whatever governing group there is and the rest of the community. And an important part of that is that there be timely sharing of agendas for meetings, and that there be clear minutes of those meetings. And that's important for steering committees, other committees, but that really brings people into the communication loop, and they know what's going on, and they don't start these rumors or get disengaged because they're unclear about things. And then I want to just go into the importance of training in co-housing communities and in any organization, that there be opportunities for people to learn more, to build skills, and to share information, share skills. So at Harmony Village for, several years, we had a nonviolent communication practice group. And that really helped establish a norm. We met a couple of times a month, and we really looked at the process. And I think it was a wonderful skill building for those of us who participated. The other thing that's important is having opportunities to share our triggers. What are our hot buttons? What are the things that bother us? An example of things to share may be how to communicate best with each of us. We each have different styles, and if you want to be able to hear me and have me hear you, this is what I need. So to have some of those dialogues is very important. What we've been able to do in Harmony Village, and I've done in many communities that I've worked with, is really encourage listening and provide listening opportunities, listening skills, listening skill building. So people are not focusing on, I want somebody to hear me, but I want to hear the other person. And an example of something that's been really helpful is to have people pair up with other people who are in a different place with them on an issue, have different perspectives. And what I've done is have people form a continuum and do that physically in our common house at a meeting or in another community, and people line up on a continuum. And on one end of the continuum is if people agree with that statement, and the other end is if people don't agree. So an example that I've used is having one end be, I'm perfectly comfortable having people from outside the community serve on meal teams. And on the other end, I want meal teams to only be for community members. Then encouraging people to pair up with someone who's in a different place on that continuum. And really there's no judgment or right or wrong. And then the exercise is to listen. So in the pair, one person's sharing why they were in that place in the continuum, what was going on for them. And then the listener is responding, what I heard you say was, did I get it? Is there anything else? And that each person has the chance to talk and to listen. And it really creates a deeper listening than what most of us are used to. And then having an opportunity, if it's a relevant, important issue, to report out and potentially to do some problem solving and brainstorming. It's important in communities to have a conversation about what support is provided and what barriers exist for direct communication. How can we individually be more supportive, and how can we be more supportive as a community? And how does an issue affect the community? What I found in many situations is that there's lots of barriers to empathy, to providing empathy and empathetic listening. And many of us are rushing around, time's limited, we're uncomfortable, we're afraid of what we're going to bring up in that conversation, and it may take too much time to deal with that. So I'm going to close now on my part and have a chance for some questions and comments, and I'd really like to hear from those of you who are out there.
So if you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask Ronnie. While everybody's figuring out where their mute button is, Ronnie, I actually have a question. You were talking about emails and now how communication is done via so much through technology. And the community I live in, Wild Sage, has this crazy long email guideline. But you said something very succinctly, and I just wanted to know if you can repeat it. I think that you said that emails are meant for information, not for feelings or decisions.
Correct. Yes. And let me also just make an exception. And a committee, and that's sort of a closed group, may need to make a fairly simple decision. We need to change our meeting. When are we going to meet? I mean, something that's not going to be controversial, will not be emotional. Does that clarify?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. I'm going to quote you on that.
Hi, Ronnie. This is Shelley Sutherland.
Hi, Shelley.
Hi. Hey, it's very interesting hearing your concept about lining people up and talking to people on the opposite sides. That's a great way to kind of understand someone else's position. Tell me though, how do you then? What's the next step of making final decisions? Or is that not part of this tonight's discussion?
It's usually, I mean, it's not part of the conversation tonight. And one thing that's been very helpful in setting up meetings and agendas is clarifying what's the purpose of an item. Is it to make a decision? Is it to have a chance for people to hear one another, etc.? Is it to provide information? And those are very different.
Yeah, I understand. I think that is an ongoing issue with people wanting to be heard. And so they're always thinking about what their next comment is going to be rather than listening to the other party. So thank you.
You're welcome.
So can I just jump in with a question?
Please, Linda.
Thank you. So one of the barriers that we have to communication is a lack of trust sometimes. So can you suggest ways or exercises that we can use to learn to trust each other enough to communicate well?
That's an issue in many organizations, groups, co-housing. And I think the more interaction people have in getting to know one another, the more trust. And that's not necessarily something that can happen at an exercise or at a meeting through an exercise. It's encouraging people to spend time together, do some physical work together, get to know one another, have a meal together, not a common house meal perhaps, but a meal at one another's home. And then really trying to understand what's going on beneath what's on the surface. And oftentimes people dig in their heels and are committed to a particular outcome or a particular perspective without really understanding what about that is so important to someone. And again, it's listening and hearing and not judging. And that takes time. And many of us try to balance out having efficient meetings with having time for getting to know one another. And those are sort of sometimes hard to balance. What we have done at Harmony Village since early on, and I recommend this for other communities, is once a quarter we have what we call a social capital meeting, and the focus really is on community building, not on making decisions, but on skill building, communication, getting to know one another. And does that, and Linda, you're muted, so I can't hear you, but does that help you a little bit? Linda's looking for the button. And you're still muted if you
Linda, we can't hear you, and I can't seem to unmute you.
Oh, okay. That's
there.
Yeah.
I got it. I'm sorry, my cat walked across the keyboard and it caused all kinds of problems, but I'm back. Yeah, that sounds great. And I like the idea of a separate social capital meeting quarterly. We do get people who are, there's a difference in the understanding of what all community meetings are about. There are those people that are impatient with anything but business, and vice versa. People who are impatient with the business and want to get together. So yes, I like that idea.
And it's also important to figure out ways to break down some of the I was going to say walls, and I don't like to use the word walls these days, but even if it's looking at breaking them down, but the labeling and categorizing. So we have new people who've been in the community for shorter periods of time. We have people who have been in communities for longer periods of time. We have older, younger, etc. And the more interaction between different groups, the better in building trust.
Yes. Okay.
It looks like Rick has.
Yeah, I have a question. Sometimes when talking about problems, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, so when we talk about problems, sometimes it seems to be better to focus not on what's wrong, but the language of what's missing. And when you talk about what's missing, it's like, what interest or need is missing. And by focusing on, if we can figure out what's missing, then you're kind of halfway to knowing what to do. It's different. So can you say something about those words being different than what's wrong? Instead say, okay, what's missing for you? And by the way, that what's missing, if it's really a need or a common interest, then we can recognize that we both have that same need.
I like that concept of what's missing for you. And that, in my mind, it's positive, and it's what do you need to be complete is how I think I would think about that. versus what's wrong tends to be blame focused, and somebody else needs to take responsibility for it. So the what's missing, if it's focusing more on what do I need versus what you need to do, I see that as really positive and can be constructive. How has that worked in your community, Rick, using that?
It's been pretty good. I live at a co-housing community in St. Louis Park, Minnesota. We call it Monterey Cohousing. It's a suburb of Minneapolis. Most of it's been pretty good, but somebody lately is like, she doesn't like that language. For me, it seems to work because, for one, if you start talking about what's wrong, well, then the person who brought up that idea might get defensive about it. Anyhow, so trying to focus on what's missing seems to be a way to kind of like get halfway to knowing what to do. You're closer to the solution rather than focusing on the problem. Any comments from other people on this chat here?
Hey, Rick, can you hear me? This is Leslie.
Yes.
This reminds me a lot of a form of management called appreciative inquiry, which came out of Case Western, where you walk into a situation, you say, what works really well, and what can we spread from what works really well to elsewhere.
Thanks, Leslie. I also have encouraged communities who have involved me in some problem solving to start off what's working well in the community, what do they want more of, and somewhat building on the appreciative inquiry concept.
Okay, if I might change subjects a little bit, some of the
Sure.
things you said, that document that you had on the screen before, will we be able to download that later?
Yes, that will be on the Coho US web chat part of the website. A recording of this web chat and that document will be there, usually
Okay.
within a couple of days.
I'm actually ahead of the game. The link to the document is already in the web chat section of the website.
Look at that.
The recording obviously will take a little longer, but you can get it right now if you want it.
Okay.
There's also a question in the chat. Karen, do you want me to read that off, or do you want to grab
Sure,
it?
go for it. Yeah.
It says, the continuum line sounds fun, useful, and interesting. What do you do if most participants are on one end of the continuum? And what do you do if many people are in the middle or undecided?
So what part of that is also what I would do is, I mean, if everybody's at one end of the continuum, then there's not much diversity of opinion, and acknowledging that's important. Perhaps hearing from a few people about what has led them to have that opinion, and similarly asking for that input if people are at different ends or there's a lot of people in the middle. Oftentimes, as maybe 4 or 5 people share why they stood where they stood, there may be awarenesses that there is difference, even though they don't know that, or they didn't know that initially. So it's an attempt to clarify without necessarily creating divisiveness.
So Ronnie, I have a question for you. When just talking about the communication in general and talking about the needs, what There's occasionally a situation in the community I live in. We're a multi-generational community, and there's some very strong supporters of kids being kids outside who tend to be quite loud. And then those that either don't have kids, or that's not necessarily true, but that wish for a little more peace and quiet. And it seems to have, it occasionally is really very clearly in two camps. And so, you know, over the years, we've figured out some ways to kind of come to some sort of middle ground. But I wonder if you might have any suggestion about kind of like a communication or team building exercise where you can encourage people to kind of be in somebody else's shoes, or think about like really encourage thinking about the exact opposite of what you inherently are. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And that's a great example, and one that living in a multi-generational community that I do live in, I've experienced that situation, so I understand. And I think, and I'm thinking of, you know, how do you get a feel for that? And to really create some of the experiential feeling, and I've not done this, but I'm just throwing it out. Perhaps having somebody who is more open to kids to be free, and kids can be noisy, and that happens. Have them be in the middle of a project or be doing something, and have a bunch of kids around trying to do what kids do, which may be make noise. And I mean, I think that's one avenue. I mean, to really try to experience what is that like for someone who doesn't have children. And I mean, and right now, if this were during the afternoon, it could be possible that a bunch of kids would be running around behind my house, and it could be disturbing. Or if I was doing some work, and I think it would be valuable for me to try to also then have and when I moved into my community, my kids were in high school, so I did not live here with little kids. But if I have the opportunity to hang out with some of my neighbor kids and realize how enthusiastic they are, and they can be loud, and how do I contain them? And that's, I mean, that's what parents try to do at times, you know, where they may like to have their children be a little bit more quiet, but it's a question of, well, how do you do it? So, I mean, that's sort of the experiential piece. I think in common houses, having a lot of children running around can be difficult for those who are older and may have mobility issues. And trying to, and actually, I mean, there are people who are not older who have mobility issues as a result of a variety of situations. And kids can be, or anyone can be, a safety challenge. So trying to get a sense of what that would be like if somebody had some limitations. So moving from, I think, that experiential piece, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, to then having a conversation about, well, what can we do to make everybody feel okay most of the time? Now, and it's not, what's our common ground? So those are my suggestions.
I'll take them. There's a question in the chat here from Henning. If you were proposing your culture meeting to a group that had not experienced it, how would you do that? And what benefits would you stress?
So I assume it's a social capital meeting. And an example that we're looking at because of our recent experience with our New Year's Eve party and different needs of some older people and younger families in our common house, I would hope that there's some conversation at our, I think it's going to be in February or March, our next social capital meeting, and trying to get people who have experienced the problem and are trying to have some resolution either in communication or trust issues, or ultimately, I mean, in decision making, because it's hard to make decisions if there's not good communication and trust. So I would look at figuring out what the concerns are and how a social capital meeting can address some of those concerns and involve some people who are pretty reluctant in the planning of it.
Henning, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
You're
Ronnie,
welcome.
Ronnie, could you talk a little bit about the format of those social capital meetings? Like what does that look like? How is it facilitated?
So that they're different. I mean, each one is a different focus. One that comes to mind in 2018 was having, based on, I mentioned the suggestion box, and we pulled out suggestions, questions, and in advance of the meeting, grouped those into certain categories that fit various teams. So something may be related to grounds and how do we get rid of trash or recycling issues. And we then shared the information in advance of what had been the question suggestions and reviewed them at the meeting and then had some small group conversations. Very often, small groups are important, either 5, 6 people or 2 or 3 people, rather than having the conversation among everybody. So I mean, that's probably one of the more consistent aspects of the social capital meeting. They're usually 3 hours with a break and pretty well thought out opportunities to get to where we want to get. Does that help, Karen?
It does. Thanks.
Ronnie, I just wanted to share, Rick was sharing when you were talking about separating people from the problem. Oh, look, he's showing us. It was reminded of the book, Getting to Yes, of the Harvard Negotiation Project.
And that is a wonderful resource, and the author lives in Colorado, William Ury. And I mean, that's something that's used very much by mediators, and it's very applicable. Thanks for sharing that, Rick.
I've been a former preschool teacher, and when it comes to solving problems, I found it very helpful to put it to the kids and say, "What do you guys think about this?" You know, maybe they could plan. Maybe they could pick certain times when they'd be, you know, play a game and make the game be, okay, we're going to be quiet for this number of hours because somebody else needs whatever. But see what the kids could do to come up with a solution to work it out with individuals and put it in their lap. And it's pretty amazing what they can do sometimes to empower them. And as you probably all know, the 3 big issues in most communities are children, chores, and pets. So.
And I will add parking to that. The 4 Ps, parenting, which is the children piece, participation, pets, and parking.
You
But
could do the C's and call them cars.
And
money. But the budget.
yes, money, finances.
Yeah.
We have involved our kids at social capital meetings, depending on what's going on. And we've had some concerns over the years about safety issues and how adults communicate to kids if they're not, if the adult is concerned about safety. And we have an expectation that children will wear, actually anyone will wear helmets on a bike, a scooter in our community. And we've had practice opportunities at our meetings to communicate with children in a way that's effective and to hear from them what works. So I think that's an important piece, Rick. Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
I had a question for Ronnie, and that was about the communication styles and the triggers. I've actually seen communications break down not because there was agreement, but just because of the style in which the communication occurred. How would you suggest sort of having people log their communication preferences? Is it just, email, I don't know, or face-to-face, or don't call me after 11, or is there some other sort of way of characterizing communication triggers?
I think part of it is having the opportunity at a meeting. I would say maybe all of the above. Not, I think in even the most engaged community, not everybody attends meetings. So having some, excuse me, let me drink some more tea, switching to hotter tea. Having perhaps a document that has some questions. We've used, and a lot of other communities use SurveyMonkey, and then tallying the information or gathering the information so that people can access it. And some things like don't call me after a certain time are pretty specific and maybe hard to remember when it's late and there's a pressing need. Somebody feels a pressing need and now I have to check the list. When can I call Karen? Can I call her after 9? Can I call her after 10? And so, I think the more that we can share and also give feedback. So if somebody is contacting me or telling me something that I need to respond to right away, as far as they're concerned, it should be okay for me and a norm to say, well, I really understand this is important to you. I can't talk about it right now. When can we talk? I think making sure there's that opportunity rather than saying, I can't talk about it now, bye. And creating the expectation that it's important to communicate, and communication involves a two-way street, involves two people, maybe more than two people. And so the person who's giving the message and the person who's receiving the message have to both be okay with timing, format, etc. Privacy, things like that are important considerations.
Great, that's really helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So Ronnie, I have a question. We have from time to time, and more often than I'd like, run into people who say, "I'm not being heard. I'm not being heard," and what they really mean is, you don't agree with me, and you're not giving in to me. You know, I mean, when we try real hard um, to understand their position and ideas and so forth, and sometimes it's we just can't get past the "I'm not being heard" piece. Even even though we say, "Well, what I hear you say is such and such," and they'll be, "Well, yeah, but," and then they'll go back to their position. Does that make sense?
It does. I think trying to differentiate between the position and the need or the strategy, and that there's different ways to meet the needs. And some people have these set positions, and trying to explore, are there other ways that could work? Excuse me, I need to grab a cough drop. Thank you. So now my throat has a tickle, and my need is to be able to communicate and talk. And there are ways I can do that. I can drink a warm beverage. I can have a cough drop. And none of those are dependent on anybody else. But when those needs become competing needs, and as Karin's situation with children and adults and noise, those can be competing. And the first thing is for people to understand and hear, and to acknowledge that they don't agree, and how can they live together? What are the basic agreements that will work for several people involved? And even though somebody might really value children being seen and not heard, and other people really want children to be free and to express themselves fully. So those are two different positions, and hearing and then perhaps brainstorming, figuring out a commonality. And then, I mean, very much what you said, Linda, of what I heard you say, and the deep listening of pairing somebody up, a pair, a triad of what I hear you saying is, and did I get it right? Is there anything else? And that, I found, the best way for people to really be heard, not agreed to, but to be heard.
Can you suggest other exercises or tools to use to help us learn to listen better, to recognize when we're not listening?
I think it's helpful to have some sort of an exercise with an observer, and perhaps having 3 people in a group, and having a talker, a listener, an observer, and that person can give feedback about listening, and that's a structured exercise in real life.
Uh-huh.
It's a little bit more difficult, and perhaps it's somebody saying, right now I'm just asking you to listen to me, and I'm not feeling heard. Can you just listen to me right now, and then I will do the same for you.
Good.
Does anybody else have any suggestions as far as Linda's question on how people can feel heard when there's a disagreement?
I think a lot of it, looking at the affective piece, I think sometimes we get into these exercises and it's like, well, I said the words that I was supposed to say, you know, I heard you say, or, you know, is there anything else? And if the tone and the facial features and, you know, that are not aligned with the really openness and interest, then the words don't come through. Another resource for this you might look at is there are a number of books by Harville Hendricks and Helen LaKelly Hunt, who are the founders of Imago Relationships. And most of them are based on familial relationships, but you can take their models and apply them to co-housing groups and use them as exercises as well. So those are a couple of suggestions.
Thank you.
All right, we have just a couple of more minutes, so I just wanted to check in and see if anybody else had a question for Ronnie. Otherwise, if you want to leave us with any last words.
Karen, would you mind writing the name of those authors in the comments or in the chat? Thank you.
Right. This is Oak Creek Commons. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have a question regarding the use of polls and the monkey survey particularly. How often has it been used? What kind of issues do you use it for? Financial, emotional? What are the results? Anything else you think is important?
What I've found, I mean, it's almost like we talked about electronic communication and using it to schedule meetings, events, what preferences people have. We got some feedback about why people don't attend meetings and are there better times that would work. Other suggestions in format. Most recently, we used it for some feedback about our common house and the cleanliness of the common house and how organized things were. And I'm sure this resonates with a lot of us who live in co-housing. And then trying to aggregate the responses and figure out some solutions. Those are the type of things that have worked in my experience. I think it has to be used carefully and thinking about how the information will be applied and not doing it too much, because I think if you do that too often, people don't respond.
Do you think some of the people who've had complaints in the community find that the use of the poll is very successful?
I didn't catch your whole question.
Okay. Did you find that the use of the polling survey satisfied the concerns of some of the people that normally were less than satisfied?
Well, I think it's the follow-up that's important. So just gathering the information, unless there's some follow-up, I mean, the information needs to be shared, the responses need to be shared, and then figuring out a way to follow up on those concerns.
Yeah, do people
otherwise it's a waste.
Yeah, do people think that the results of the poll have been followed up successfully?
I think so.
You could always do a poll on that.
Yes. Great idea.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And with that, I think we'll go ahead and close. Ronnie, did you have anything you wanted to say at the end here?
No, other than thank you all, and I wish I had time to connect with each of you individually and find out who you are and where you live and learn about your communities.
So thank you so much, Ronnie, for being here tonight, and thank you all for being here. I went ahead and put 3 links in the chat. The first one is to the Coho US website, to the web chats, which has the schedule for upcoming web chats. The next one, let's see here, is next Tuesday, the 15th, January 15th, same time, so 6 p.m. Mountain, and it's Katie McCammett, and she'll be talking about hiring professionals. So the complete schedule is on the website there, as well as the past videos and documents from past web chats. Also, I put in the chat over here information, or excuse me, the link to the Portland National Co-Housing Conference, which is in May of 2019, and registrations for that will be opening on January 15th. And so when registrations open, all of the information will be on the conference website, including speakers and presenters and intensive and a schedule and information about lodging and tours. And it's going to be an amazing conference in Portland, Oregon. And then the last link that I put in the chat is these web chats are a free offering of Coho US, as are quite a few things like the website and all the blogs and the information and the e-news and all that sort of thing. And we still have to operate as a business. So if you're interested in making an individual donation to the association, I put the link there. I just heard from somebody today using the phrase, they've decided that they're going to call themselves an evergreen neighbor. So their intention is to donate a small amount every month to the association. And it's kind of like the whole NPR evergreen member thing, but she decided that because we're not members, but we're all neighbors, we're all connected through co-housing, that she's decided she's going to consider herself an evergreen neighbor. So, and I think that's about it. Thank you everybody so much for being here tonight.
What?
And hopefully we'll see you next week.
What?
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.